who founded this Conflict Research Society with other colleagues. It's still going, it's having its conferences, and they're doing good work. And as I say, there was another great Australian thinker called John Burton, who was part of this school, who taught for a time at University College in the 60s. He'd been a Labour supporting diplomat with the Australian Foreign Ministry, and he worked for the Australian Foreign Ministry. He was attached to the Australian team that went to the founding of the United Nations conference in San Francisco back in the 40s, in 45 after the war. And he, like me, thought through in great detail. I mean, I didn't know it existed until I actually met him eventually at the LSE when I was into my job for the University of London, and he was one of the names that kept popping up. I studied his work, and yes, he did some great work on conflict and its prevention and its resolution. And what he found is that conflict arises when communication is blocked or leads into difficulties. And this is true at, like, whether it's a family row, a family quarrel, a couple breaking up, or a village falling apart, or different religions fighting, or different nations, or different ideologies. It's always this common theme that communication is blocked, and somebody's trying to silence somebody else's truth, and not being respectful, and not being, not listening, and so on. There's signs that you can see, which, if you're a trained analyst, you can say, that conflict's in trouble, right? I mean, we all know it when our friends' marriages start falling apart, and they can't speak to each other without shouting. A divorce is going to be coming soon, or they're going to spend a lot of time apart. And the same with nations and with countries. Now, so what these colleagues of mine, I mean, John Burton is no longer alive, sadly, but he did found a great centre at George Mason University, just near Washington, D.C., which does this work. He was also involved in setting up a centre at the University of Kent, which is still going, which many colleagues of mine are involved with, which also does this work, and they have great PhD programmes and so on. There are other centres in the UK at the University of Ulster, and obviously Bradford and elsewhere. What happens with conflict is it seems to start off from this misunderstanding, this miscommunication, and then it can escalate. And if people continue to not listen and to shout each other down and then to try and do political suppression manoeuvres and so on, then the other lot are going to kind of come back and do something else, and the whole thing escalates, right? And there's this cycle of what's called conflict escalation that can soon get out of hand, and it can lead then eventually to violence. If you nip it in the bud, and if you address the concerns, and if you can intervene as an outside mediator, and give both parties an opportunity to air their grievances and their problems, you can ventilate the rage, the anger, the suppressed feelings, and they can listen to each other, which is of course what they're not doing as the conflict escalates. And then, 9 times out of 10 you can get a successful mediation. And this works true between neighbours or families or couples or bigger groupings, countries and religions. And let me just remind you, I did trainings in mediation in the States, in San Francisco and in London, and I worked as a mediator in neighbourhood disputes, and then I set up the only interfaith mediation service in the world that still exists, which is still going. And I'm open to volunteers that want to come and help. You don't have to kind of live in France, but it's an international project dealing with interfaith mediation. So if you have a special interest in mediation, then there's a training package that we can put together. And we need your help, especially lawyers and people with some kind of legal training. It's very useful. But the crucial thing is, if you don't get the mediation, if you don't get that mutual listening, the conflict will escalate and spiral out and of command and become problematic and violent. And as academic experts, our job is to warn people when this is likely to happen. Now, of course, so that's what I'm doing in relation to Brexit, and I want to be very succinct and clear about this. I've tried to warn. When this whole business started and the Brexit referendum came, and I thought long and hard about it, and I thought, no, I've got to vote Remain here. It's too dangerous to go down the Brexit route, because I knew what I'm about to share with you. I could see it coming. Because of my training as an academic expert in conflict, I could see that Brexit would lead to conflict. And it's immoral and irresponsible of me to do things that will exacerbate and lead to conflict. I'm the guy that puts out conflicts, not the guy that stimulates them. And I'd been to Ireland several times, and I'd met a lot of Irish peace research people and experts in this field, colleagues of mine in Dublin and both north and south of the border, so in Ulster, attached to the universities in Belfast, and also in the south. I went to Limerick to a big conference of peace researchers and so on. And I realised how hard they'd had to suffer during their time of troubles in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the 90s. Bombs were going off in Belfast. This was Britain's little dirty civil war. And I remember growing up as a boy in Brighton, and you'd read on the news, bombs going off in Belfast. We never really knew what it was all about. We just sort of wished it would go away. But as I studied history and learned more about it, and met people, I realised that it needed to be stopped. And I know that different people tried, but it was not until, can you believe it, not until 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement that we finally got an agreement that stopped all that time of troubles. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have been massacred, killed, tortured. It was a nightmare. And that's what inspired me to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, because as a peace thinker and activist, I created from my institute various structures, holding structures, to help ventilate the conversation, to help. It's like opening the windows of a darkened room and letting the light in, so that people can greet each other and say, God, during the time of troubles, it was horrible. I mean, I went and interviewed people and filmed it. It was recorded on camera, some of our work. And I remember meeting people in Belfast who lived through the time of troubles, when pubs were being blown up and people were being killed randomly, pretty much. And I remember having a conversation with a very intelligent guy about, were there a lot of ghosts around at the time? And yes, the fact is yes. So we don't want to go back there. We don't want to go back there, I assure you, my friends. So what's my concern here is that there are serious warning signs around Brexit, and I'm simply now putting on the hat of all that peace work I've done over 40 years actually, and then my academic research, which is scientifically validated by the world's leading scholars in this field. I'm not speaking as a maverick. I'm speaking with a body of expertise behind me. This problem of conflict escalation is what's going to happen if Brexit is imposed. Now, I wrote to Theresa May and I advised her of this very early on in her premiership, and she utterly, totally, and completely ignored me. Right, so I have no negative, sorry feelings about her resignation speech. I think the woman is not educated to the level at which one needs to be the Prime Minister of a state as great and as potentially important as the UK. It's an amazing country. I love it, but it does require sensitivity to all of its regions. And I've lived for 10 years in Wales, I've lived in Scotland, I've travelled much in Ireland, and I know all the different parts of England and London and Brighton like the back of my hand. I know the country very well, and the West Country and Cornwall and all the rest of it. And I know that what the Tories have been doing is extremely insensitive to the cultural and intellectual and spiritual aspirations of the country as a whole. So I think it's absolutely time that Theresa May goes. I mean, she should have, gone a long time ago, in my opinion, and probably we're going to have a general election to elect a new government, which I sincerely hope will be a Remain government, because the alternative is catastrophic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me try and explain why, because it's become a sort of like a intellectual jostling match between two wrestlers. There's the Remain lot and the Leave lot. And people who think they're moderate are now saying, oh, well, they're both extremists, let's, I'll be in the middle somewhere. Yeah. I know the temptation. British people are very fair. We love to be in the middle. Give us a chance and we'll be moderate. But on this occasion, that logic doesn't work. I'm sorry to have to explain it. And I'm going to explain why in detail, so bear with me. Let me go back to this problem of conflict escalation. You see, okay, so let's imagine Brexit is imposed. Let's say Boris Johnson or someone like him gets into power and he buys, being a corrupt politician, that's what he would do. He buys enough votes in the Commons to push it through. And hard Brexit, because no deal in sight's worth having, so pushes through a hard Brexit. And it comes into force in October. I personally don't think that's going to happen, because I don't think parliamentarians are that stupid. I don't think any Tory leader is going to be able to cobble that together, because the people have rumbled what they're up to. This is a self-interested, elitist cabal of very rich people who are buying, literally, Brexit. And they've just created the Brexit Party because the Tory party disappointed them. Theresa May, for all her, I grumble about her, but she did at least have a little bit of moderation in her system. And she knew that a hard Brexit wasn't going to happen, and on her watch. Well, I wish she would legislate that it can't happen before she leaves office. It would be the final parting gift. Thank you, ma'am. It might make up. I personally would wish she would legislate for a second referendum before she leaves office. But I don't think she's got the imaginative depth to realise that's what she should be doing. So I don't think it's going to happen. But let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that the pro-Brexit lobby, this new Brexit party, and hard right of the Tories elect a hard Brexit guy, kind of Rees-Mogg, nightmare from hell, and they push Brexit down the throats of the entire country. And 1 million people march on London and they're shot at by the police. We're going to have a sort of like a neo-fascist coup coming in. Farage and co will be shooting at them, from they'll God knows what. It's a nightmare situation. But let's imagine they push it through, right? Okay, what's wrong with that scenario? Well, it's what the people voted for in 2016. That's jolly good, And that's the line the BBC have been pumping out since 2016, and all the mass media that are kind of without, they haven't thought it through really. So, okay, my concern is the following: all the warning signs are that this will lead to conflict, it re-emerging in the British Isles in a potentially major and disastrous way. Okay, so let me be specific. There are 4 particular arenas of conflict that might well escalate if Brexit is pushed into place. And this is why I've been jumping up and down for the last couple of years. This is why I'm doing a weekly fast. I'm trying to prevent this conflict escalating. Okay, what do I mean? The first conflict zone that is the most dangerous is in Northern Ireland. If Brexit is pushed through, the people of Northern Ireland, don't forget, voted a majority to remain in the European Union. Okay, so that is a huge, huge sign that the people of Northern Ireland are not just going to meekly go along with what Westminster says. And by the laws passed at the Good Friday Agreement, by an international treaty, the people of Northern Ireland have to be asked in a referendum if they want to go along with the rest of the UK and leave the European Union, or if they want to rejoin with the Republic of Ireland and become one country and stay in the European Union. Now that is in law, that's what should happen. the fact that the Tory government and the Tory press haven't been saying this loud and clear since day one is a scandal. They've been deliberately trying to hoodwink the people of Northern Ireland into thinking they don't have any rights, that Brexit is a done deal, that they can't say anything or do anything. Well, actually, that's just simply lies. We've been having a government in Westminster under these Tories who've been lying through their teeth and suppressing the facts as I've just expressed them. And I'm speaking as chair of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland. Before we can get reconciliation, we have to have truth. There's been no truth here. The fact is, the Good Friday Agreement says in its text, which I have a copy of here, that if there are significant changes to the political makeup of the province, then they have a right for a referendum. And rejoining the Republic would be one of the options. Now, I have no doubt, personally, knowing the Irish as I do, knowing their intelligence, I've been to London, Derry. I've travelled around Belfast. I've met people. I've hosted conferences there, and I've communed with the spirits of the Northern Irish ancestors in their wonderful ancient hill forts, and also the early Christians. St Patrick is reputed to be buried there. At Armagh, I've been to Armagh on pilgrimage. And St Columba is connected with Ireland. So, with Northern Ireland particularly. So I have no doubt that they would vote to rejoin the Republic of Ireland. The people of Northern Ireland have benefited from membership in the European Union. It's led to freedom of trade between the two parts of Ireland. It's led to a whole new generation who have hope and freedom of movement throughout the whole of Europe. It's led to intellectual and academic exchanges between Northern Ireland universities and European scholars. And their Celtic studies is a big thing. Irish studies is a big thing here in Europe. We love the Irish, right? And at the University of Vienna and elsewhere, Irish studies is a big thing of great interest. One of the big interests is what's the link between the ancient Germanic peoples and the old Celtic peoples? Celts are all over Europe, not just in Ireland and Britain. They're an amazing people. Who are they? Where did they come from? When did they evolve? Were they the Urnfield culture? Did they bring the cart and the wheel to Europe? Did they bring iron? I mean, who are these Celts? And who were their Druids? These are very interesting questions, studied in Europe and studied in Ireland. In Dublin, there's some amazing people. If you go around the National Museum of Ireland, you find these incredible Druidic type remains. They're wonderful lunulae made of pure gold, which are as beautiful as the Mycenaean gold, which I've also been to in Mycenae. So this is a pan-European culture, these Celts, and they're proud and amazing people. Their Druids were pretty awesome, and their Druidesses as well. And their different deities, which I'm studying in detail, compiling a dictionary of them all. Here in Europe, it's very interesting. When the Romans came, the Celts, they tried to stop them and fought some big battles, but eventually they lost. And they just sort of said, now life carries on. We're going to go on being pagan Druids, and our temples will just let a few of your Roman gods in. So they married up one of their most important goddesses, Rosmerta, with Mercury, who was the Roman god of communications, trade, travel. Rosmerta was the goddess of fertility and plenty and prosperity. And there are temples to Rosmerta and Mercury all over the Druid areas of Europe. And in Britain, she was a big goddess in the Durbunai tribe in Cirencester way. So what they were doing is sort of peace theology. They were saying, well, we'll take one of our Druid deities, we'll marry it to one of your Roman deities, and we'll make peace. And this was a big thing the Treveri tribe did around the Moselle River in Trier. They were extremely religious people, and they had temples they married Apollo to Sirona, who was a beautiful goddess of healing and beauty and a very amazing goddess. She was always shown with a snake around her arm, right? And she was Apollo's consort, for God's sake. Apollo was the most incredible of these Roman Greek gods, the Druids thought, because he was their god, the goddess of the god of healing, poetry, the bards, prophecy, and the finding out of the harmony behind the universe, like Orpheus and Pythagoras had done. So the Druids resonated with Apollo, and so they married him to their best goddess, Sirona, who was an absolute stunner. So there's another happy marriage that was done by these peace theologians of the Druids, who were now saying, okay, you can't defeat the Romans militarily. We'll defeat them culturally by love. Yeah? And so that's what Europe is premised on, that sort of peace move. And that's what the Irish were involved in. After not too long, the Christians came along and said, well, our God is the best, God of Christ. And what did the Druids do? Well, they adapted it into the system. So you now had their Christian churches on the site of the old Druid pagan temples, and you had the saints playing the same role as the different deities. And Druids studied in detail Christian esoteric stuff. It's obvious they had access to Gnostic scriptures. Taliesin, the great bard of Britain, was reading Gnostic texts, quoting Enoch and God knows what. In Robert Graves' White Goddess, he's traced that to source. And we do need, by the way, a proper annotated, footnoted version of the White Goddess. I challenge any scholars out there to work with me on providing that. Because Mark Carter's Stalking the Goddess is a bit of a put-down. It's a good book, but he doesn't properly, I think, give Graves his due, who was a genius, don't forget. And anyway, fast forward, the Irish, I'm part Irish, can't you tell, right? We don't like war, we like peace, and we want to go on doing peace in Ireland. And we want to go on doing peace whether we're Catholic or Protestant or pagan or Irish or incomer or, from the moon, or if we're the Tuatha De Danann who are still, in the Sidhe. We don't want some idiots in Westminster telling us we're going to do Brexit. No, it's not going to happen. And so, it's Remain, folks. So Northern Ireland is going to be voting for staying in the European Union. Now, the people in Westminster that are pushing Brexit, the kind of money men, the corrupt bankers paid for by, the Murdochs of this world and the unknown money people that run the City of London and so on, or used to. I don't know what's happened to the poor City of London. It's going so far downhill so fast. Anyone with any brains is getting out. Theresa May's chased them all out. So anyway, the people that think Brexit is a good idea, these nouveau riche Aaron Banks types, they don't actually have any substantial knowledge of cultural capital and the social importance of wealth. They just think I'm going to make a killing at Brexit, so let's push it. Well, if those people push it, they're going to lose Northern Ireland. It's as simple as that. However, the danger is, now if there's a referendum and the City of London, the Westminster, if it's run by a Brexit bunch who've taken over Parliament, will do all it can to prevent that referendum happening, but it will be forced, they will have to do it. And the Northern Irish parties for Remain will insist, and there'll be general strikes, God knows what. So that's the first kind of conflict possibility, is Westminster trying to deny the referendum, people of Northern Ireland, agitating for it. And that would erupt into a serious conflict. The only way out of that is to let them have the referendum. Okay, so let's say that referendum then results in a victory for staying in Ireland, ending Northern Ireland's association with the United Kingdom. There's a very, very strong probability that the extreme Ulster Protestants, who identify themselves as Unionists, would seriously agitate against that. Even if there was a referendum victory, a clear mandate, they would still say, over our dead body, we will fight. Because they have a history of doing that. And so there's a flashpoint potential of escalation, to go back to the conflict escalation cycle, that the Ulster Unionists would at that point sort of start stockpiling weapons and go back into a bombing campaign aimed at terrifying all the nice, fluffy kind of Irish let's all unite Ireland and live happily ever after types who voted for it, saying no, over our dead body, you know, and they would blow up symbolically and whatever, start pub bombings. And whereupon, of course, sadly, tragically, the IRA, which has been to sleep ever since its 1998 Good Friday Agreement, it would reactivate, it would rearm to protect its people, which is what it did in the very beginning. And you would get counter bombings, and then before you know it, we'd be back into another time of troubles. The new time of troubles would be launched. And it wasn't a clean fight, you know, it wasn't the first time. So what we now know as historians, and it's come out in various books recently published, that the British state, in its intelligence wing, was colluding with the Protestant so-called loyalists, right? With intelligence, and there was a collusion going on. So that would almost certainly happen again, right? The military intelligence, MI6, MI5, would secret its people into Northern Ireland, and what they were doing is a mixture of, you know, killings, informants, penetration, all kinds of dirty tricks, you know, and they would just start all that again. And before you can blink, it would be a nightmare. Who would lose out is the ordinary people of Northern Ireland, the people of the shopkeepers, the pub owners, the men and women that, you know, work in the markets. I mean, in the old days, markets were bombed. People just died, you know, random, ordinary civilians. This is not a clean fight we're talking about. So I'm warning, as a conflict specialist, that this is the likely scenario. There is no possibility, there's no strategy I can see that if Brexit is imposed from Westminster, that violence will not break out again in Northern Ireland, apart from if a referendum is held, they unite with the whole Republic, and the Protestant loyalists then stand down. They are told 100% from London, you will not fight. And the British state refuses to give them intelligence or weapons, and you know, they're left to be part of that new island. The trouble is, of course, this would be a bit like the Israeli settlers after the Palestinians get their state. You know, unfortunately, they would probably fight rather than accept that. They will agitate to remain part of Greater Israel, and they have weapons to prove, you know, to buttress that. I've seen them march through the city of Jerusalem when the settlers come in to pray at the Wailing Wall. They've always got their machine guns at the ready in case. I don't want that happening in Ireland, you know. So, anyway, it's, for me, someone who loves Ireland and is proud of the peace process that was established there finally, in which I played a tiny little role in, by going and talking with the Druid community mainly, and the Christian community and the peace research community, and by setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland. So I don't want all that work undone. I mean, it's. I feel like Michelangelo here in the studio, and some idiots are coming and spray painting over the work I've been doing on the Sistine Chapel. For God's sake, get these hooligans out. You know, guards. Because that's, the Brexit lot are that, to me, they're that, you know, uncouth. Because Ireland is a very ancient, sophisticated culture which deserves its peace. It's very hard won. We don't have the right to impose war back on the streets of Northern Ireland. We don't. And there's nothing that a Brexiteer can tell me, a Farage or any of his cronies, will make me change my mind on that. I know I'm right. And, you know, however, all I'm saying is, if Brexit is pushed down their throats in spite of all this, there is a huge 99% chance it will result in violence. The conflict will escalate so rapidly. That's why Europe and the European Union have insisted that Brexit has to somehow take account of this problematic. I mean, the only way that it could be solved is if Northern Ireland rejoins the Irish Republic and the rest of the British Isles does a Brexit. There is no other political way or intellectual way. But of course, you see, Brexiteers don't want to hear that because they've not been told it by the media. The BBC have been utterly silent on this fact. The mainstream newspapers have been pretty silent. And it's incredible to watch as that propagandistic type of media control has just silenced this debate. So I can only just shout it from the rooftops as much as possible. This is a conflict escalation point. And as a peace scholar who's dedicated my life to peace, I will not go down lightly and let this happen. On behalf of my friends in Ireland, and also in Britain, who would have to then be sent in as squaddies and etc. etc. And the whole thing would be a nightmare. Okay, that's my first escalation point. The second one I want to come to, which is almost equally as important, it might take longer, is the case of Scotland. Because I lived in Scotland for 7 years. I have many dear friends from Scotland. I went up to Scotland as sort of English-Canadian internationalist, with Welsh leanings and part Irish, and I came back a Scotsman. I understand the Scots in a way that I didn't before. I loved them, and I know where they're coming from, in a way that is again, I have not met many English people who've ever had that possibility of living in Scotland and studying there and getting to understand under the skin what it is like to be Scottish. Now, I just want to therefore say, I predict there's a huge escalation potential here, because if Brexit is pushed down the Scots' throats again, as I've said, through a Westminster extremist faction that managed to seize power, and with the collusion of a demented Labour Party, I have to say, Mr Corbyn, ought to be going back to Adams Grammar School, where I used to teach in Shropshire. He ought to go back and read political science. He's making so many disastrous errors that it's unbelievable. He seems to think that political pragmatism requires ambiguity and that you can straddle both sides of an argument and you can be loved by everybody. I mean, that is the error of a 3-year-old in political science. No, true politics is you work out the synthesis of possibilities, what's available, then you choose the maximal one that will give everybody greatest possible happiness in a sort of utilitarian calculus, if you want, and then you stick to that principle come hell or high water. Having made that choice, having worked it out logically and ethically, you then are truthful and say, look, this is the choice I think is best for the British people. I've thought it through. That's the choice my Labour Party are going to go for. And, we will stick to that. Now, if anyone apart from Corbyn, anyone with an actual brain like John Smith or, many of the other great former Labour leaders, Harold Wilson, who I grew up with respecting as a boy, if they were in power, they would have realised Brexit is a nightmare. And the Labour movement would have made clear that all its main interests were in remaining in the European Union and changing it from within. But instead, for reasons that are just, I suppose there's a certain bubble of greyness over Islington that makes people unable to think clearly. I used to live in Islington. It's very disappointing to me. My institute was based in London initially, and I lived and worked in Upper Street, and I love Islington. What has